Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell, and today we're going to talk about why most writing advice sucks. And my thesis statement for this is basically that anyone can write, and because everyone tackles writing so differently, I think everyone thinks that when they have figured out how to write successfully, whatever that means to them, that they have the answers and the way they figured it out must be the right way. So I think that's why a lot of times even famous authors or professors of creative writing can still sometimes give really bad advice. So I am no expert in writing. I have not published a book or anything significant, but I am writing a book, and I do watch a lot of content related to writing and have heard a lot of common writing advice at this point. So I just want to talk about like 10 or 12 different ones that I have written down that I have heard more than once that I think are either bad advice or so simple that they need so much additional context that the writing advice itself is basically meaningless. I was inspired to make this video by a great video that I just watched, which was Brandon Sanderson in conversation with Tim from Hello Future Me, which is a great YouTube channel, and both of them talking about the worst writing advice they had ever heard. And so some of the ones that I am talking about are ones that they mentioned as well, so I'll be sure to link their video down below because it was the inspiration that I got for this video. So let's get to it. The very first one is one that I'm sure you have heard 1,000 times if you are in the writing world, and that is show, don't tell. I think the idea behind this comes from the right place. I think if you implement this in the right way, then it is good advice. But again, it's so oversimplified in this like tagline of show, don't tell that I think it can be really misconstrued. What show, don't tell actually means is basically like describe, don't explain. And also just like obviously showing your audience, the readers, the things that you want them to know rather than telling them something. So for instance, if your main character is a badass assassin, then we need to see them doing badass assassin things. We can't be told that they're a badass assassin and then never see that happen on the page. And maybe the first time that they get into a scrape, they completely fall to pieces or don't know what to do. They're obviously not a badass assassin if that is what we see them doing. So I think that's one kind of interpretation of this is like whatever you want your readers to know, we need to see on the page. But another kind of interpretation of this as far as like describe, don't explain is say your character is about to stand up and give a speech in front of a bunch of people and they're really nervous. Saying they're really nervous is explaining to the reader rather than showing the reader. To show the reader, you could say something like they wiped their sweaty palms on their jeans, or they were pacing behind stage, or something like that. That would actually show us that they're feeling nervous without having to tell us that they're feeling nervous. However, I think some people can definitely take this too literally in terms of saying it's like literally never okay to explain or tell something in your story. And that's definitely not true. It takes a lot more words to show something to the reader, to describe it. A lot of times you don't want your pacing of your narrative to get bogged down with long descriptions of things when it would just be much simpler and keep the flow of the story going better if you just used a simple one sentence explanation. So again, I think this show, don't tell in general, like the heart of the advice is in the right place, but it can definitely be taken way too seriously. The second piece of writing advice that I want to immediately like put a big thumbs down on is write what you know. Write what you know is honestly terrible advice. In terms of like, obviously if you're writing like fantasy or sci-fi or anything speculative, you don't know anything about that's completely made up. So like, how can you only write what you know? Or like if you're from the Midwest and you want to write about living in the South, like there's no reason you shouldn't be able to do that. I think write what you know is terrible advice. You can really grow as a writer by writing about things that you don't know. However, I think the big cautionary tale here is you need to make sure that whatever you're writing about, you give the proper amount of weight and justice to. And so you don't want to write from a perspective that you haven't personally experienced without doing your research and having sensitivity readers potentially clue you into some things in your language or the way you describe characters that could be potentially harmful or leaning into harmful stereotypes. For instance, if you want to write about a character that has a mental health issue, you want to make sure that you're representing someone who has that mental health issue in a way that is accurate to the people actually living that life. So there just has to be a lot of research and diligence that goes into writing what you don't know. I think there is an interpretation of write what you know, which I think is the only one that is good advice, which is you know what it's like to have feelings, right? Like you probably know what it feels like to be betrayed or to be lied to or to be really sad or to be extremely joyful or, you know, any range of emotions. You've probably experienced them all. And so being able to write what you know in terms of, even if you're writing about something you're very unfamiliar with, you can imagine what that person would be feeling in that situation. And so bringing what you know of those feelings into your narrative, I think would be really powerful. Then we have to talk about dialogue tags. People have a lot of feelings about dialogue tags that you should only ever use said is one of them that I hear a lot. You should never say he explained or he shouted. And then there's some people that also say you should never use dialogue tags at all and that people should just be able to tell which character is talking based on their differences in personality and things like that. And I think that is a good aspiration, but isn't very effective in reality. And I also think there's nothing wrong with occasionally using other words besides said. The idea is that said is an invisible dialogue tag. And so if you just include he said, she said, they said, that kind of thing, that readers can just kind of skim through it. But if you use a bunch of different words like explained or shouted or whispered or whatever, that it like trips up the reader and can really mess with the pacing and just feel a little less authentic. But I think you'll find that any published book that you pick up uses different dialogue tags, even though said is definitely the most common one. And I think in the previous video that I mentioned, Hello Future Me, Tim had actually evaluated like Stephen King and Brandon Sanderson and some other famous authors and found that they used said basically about 85% of the time and other ones about 15% of the time. So I think you just have to find the right balance for your own writing. Another big one that I hear a lot is don't use adverbs, which are words basically that end in ly. I think the sentiment is that anytime you use an adverb, there is a stronger verb that you could use instead. So if you wanted to say he said quietly, you could just say he whispered, and it means the same thing but with less words and more impact. But again, I don't think there's anything wrong with using adverbs. I think that's kind of a trend, and you definitely don't want to overuse them, and you do want to look for those stronger verbs when they're right there. But an occasional adverb here and there is totally fine. And again, you will find adverbs in every published book that you pick up. Some writers like to say write when the muse strikes, and I doubt that those people have ever published a book. Writing is hard work, and writing a book is very hard work, and you really have to create a habit or set aside time to write, whether you're feeling inspired or not. I'm sure you don't feel inspired to go to work every day, but you go to work every day and get the work done anyway. And I think successful writers use the same attitude and approach to their own writing. And again, the whole like waiting for the muse to strike thing, it just overly romanticizes writing, which is, I think people who think about writing in terms of like a muse or like a strike of lightning or anything like that for their inspiration, they just have a view of writing that it's like divinely inspired or something, rather than just like if you sit down and make a practice of it, then the words will flow. The opposite of that writing advice is write every day. I hear this from a ton of different people that you need to write every day, and that's absolutely not true. While I do think you should have a habit of writing, if you want to be a writer, and maybe like a schedule of like, maybe you can only write once a week or twice a week or on your lunch break or whatever, you know, there's absolutely no reason that you need to write every day, even if having a schedule or a habit of writing is a good thing. Writing every day is just not feasible for everyone, and it's really like gatekeepy, I think, and kind of weird to say that you like have to be writing every day. Not everyone is privileged enough to have that time. Another common piece of writing advice is make your characters likable. This is one specifically that Hello Future Me was talking about, in that you don't need to have likable characters, you just need to have interesting characters. It's okay to have unlikable characters as long as the readers want to know more about them. Another piece of writing advice that you'll hear sometimes is write to market, which I think most writers know is not what you want to be doing. You know, like there was a big dystopian trend in writing in the 2000s with like Hunger Games and Divergent and Maze Runner and, you know, all the other ones, I don't know, that came out at the time. Writing towards a trend is never a good idea, because you should be writing what you're excited to write about, what you're passionate about, what story you feel like needs to be told. I think the really great writers are the trend setters, not the trend followers, and the ones who follow the trend aren't usually the most memorable parts of the trend. And if you are traditionally publishing, at least publishing a book takes sometimes years, even if you've already submitted it to your agents and editors and things. And so by the time that book is potentially published, that you wrote because it was trending at the time that you wrote it, it might not be trending anymore anyway. So yeah, definitely just write the story of your heart and don't worry about what's trending. And I think the passion that you have for your story will come through better, and the story will be better for it. I also hear people say don't write prologues, or like agents and editors aren't looking for prologues. I get the idea behind this, because often a prologue will follow like a character who isn't going to be the main character, or it's like potentially unnecessary for the story overall. But sometimes prologues are great and tell an interesting piece of the story that we wouldn't get any other way. So again, I think this is just like a trend right now that for some reason prologues are out of style, but sometimes stories need a prologue, and I think that's absolutely silly to say like don't write prologues. I mean, if it works for your story, it works for your story, and it doesn't matter what people say. Okay, this next one isn't one I hear a lot, but I have heard it more than once, which is bizarre to me. But some people will say don't read while you're writing because it will overly influence your work. And maybe that's true for some people, but personally, I think great writers are great readers and read widely, especially within their own genres, but other things as well. And I think knowing what else is out there in your genre that you're writing, I think is a really important part of keeping up with what's good and what people like and what you like. I think getting ideas from other sources is great. No idea that you have could be completely free of influence or totally unique. So don't worry about being overly influenced by other people's writings unless you just feel that that is something that specifically pertains to you. I've also heard people say that if you want to write a book that you need to practice first with short fiction or short stories. And that's really weird to me, because those are completely different types of writing, and being good at writing short stories does not translate to being good at writing novels. There's just too much to a novel to be able to hold in your head all at once. And while writing short stories might be good in terms of like keeping you motivated or getting you to really like nail down your style, you're still ultimately not going to be able to write a novel until you've written a novel. Second to last one I have is don't edit as you write. This is one that I hear people say, which I think is good in general advice, because you don't want to get so bogged down in editing or like rewriting your first chapter, act one or whatever, that you never are able to progress and finish the story. So I get the sentiment behind it is like, don't let editing bog you down from finishing your work. But I think it's totally fine to edit as you go. I personally, usually as I'm writing, I'll go back and read what I wrote the day before. I'll edit that to like get me back into the flow of the story, and then move on to whatever I'm writing for that day, the next scene or chapter or whatever. But yeah, just don't get caught in an editing loop, I think is the better advice. And then lastly, I've heard people say don't use tropes, and I think people who say this just don't understand what a trope is. Maybe they mean like don't use cliches, which is a trope done poorly. Tropes are ingredients of a story. You can't make a story without tropes. So I think just there's like a semantic thing here that's like not connecting on some level. But no matter what story you write, there's going to be some tropes in it, even if you didn't write it with that intent to begin with. A trope is just a common storytelling element. So that's all I have as far as common writing advice and why most of it kind of sucks. Again, they're either just too prescriptive, they're too simplified, or they're just silly. Hopefully, if you had seen any of this writing advice before and took it too close to heart and thought, oh, I'm doing something wrong because I haven't been following this advice, I think that's fine. Everyone's different. Everyone's writing process is different. Take every piece of writing advice you hear with a grain of salt, including everything that I just said. You know, just take what works for you and leave the rest behind. Anyway, thanks for tuning in and listening to me ramble about bad writing advice. As always, please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you again next time. Bye.